Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacob Covell. I'm the co-president of the Men's Club. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our program this evening, which will begin in just a couple of minutes. Before we actually get started, since you're a captive audience and we have you here, the Men's Club would like to announce that we're doing a lot of programs, this being one of them. And to give you an idea of what we've got coming up, on Sunday morning, February 13th, before you all dig into the Super Bowl, we welcome you to participate in the worldwide wrap in the sanctuary. Well, I'm not sure if it's in the sanctuary, but it'll be in the synagogue, in the temple, with its traditional annual program supporting the learning how to wear tefillin and the opportunity to wear tefillin. And that will be followed by a brief program with Rabbi Zarin. Then on Monday, February 28th, we have a speaker program much like this one with Dr. Josh Stein, and he's going to talk about men's health issues. 2 weeks after that, on March 10th, Thursday, March 10th, we have the Israeli Council General, or the Council General of Israel to New England. Marin Rubin is going to speak in this program is in support of, with the support of the Israel Engagement Committee. So we invite you to register for that and listen to Ambassador Rubin. On March 27th, we're going to have a yellow candle packaging and mailing for the Yom HaShoah Remembrance Day, that it will be in April. So if you want to participate and in the packaging process, you're more than welcome to join us that day. The details for that will come shortly. And on Sunday, May 15th, we are sponsoring another outing for the Hartford Yard Goats. So we have tickets in a very nice area of the stadium, and exclusive access to one of their clubs. And we invite you to join us for baseball in Hartford. So that's just a small portion of what we've got coming up. We invite you to join us in all of those activities. And again, I thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn the microphone over to David Sabino to introduce our speaker and get us started. David, you're up.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight for this special program. I'm David Sabino from the board of the Bethel Men's Club. As many of you know, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, dedicated by the United Nations nearly 2 decades ago as a way to ensure that the world never forgets the atrocities committed upon the Jewish people. The date coincides with the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp in 1945. We in the Bethel Temple community are privileged that one of our members is one of the foremost Holocaust scholars in the nation. Dr. Avi Patt is the Doris and Simon Konover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He has written extensively about the Jewish experience and resiliency in the aftermath of those atrocities. His latest work examines the dynamic between Israel and its complex relationship with the Holocaust. Please welcome Dr. Avi Patt.
Great, thank you so much, David. And I want to thank the Men's Club for organizing and for having me here this evening. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you here this evening. As David mentioned, today, January 27th, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So we are 77 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, and it's fitting that we are gathered here for hopefully an opportunity to learn a little bit about the history, but also to engage in this process of remembering. I'm going to share my screen, so we can see sort of the subject of what I'm going to be talking about, which is Israel and the Shoah, or Israelis in the Shoah. And by the end of my remarks this evening, I think you'll have a sense for why I am trying to make that distinction. This presentation is based on a book project that I'm working on right now, which examines the history of Israel's relationship to the Holocaust. And so some of what I'm going to talk about this evening is related to my thought process. This is sort of a work in progress about the history of this relationship and some of the things, the questions that I'm trying to resolve in terms of writing and working on this book. But you also hear some reflections based on other projects that I've worked on, including my most recent book, which looks at the Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, the afterlife of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I'm going to intersperse in there some of those components. The cover slide that you can see here, in some sense, captures the dynamics of this relationship as we think about the relationship between the Holocaust or the Shoah and the creation of the state of Israel. I'll come back to this slide and explain what we're actually looking at in this picture here. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about where this image actually came from. So what I'm going to look at this evening is examining the relationship between the state of Israel and the Shoah, the relationship between Israel and the Holocaust. And while one of the factors that we're going to look at is this larger question of historically, as a historian, I ask historical questions. Did the Holocaust make the creation of the state of Israel more or less likely, which I will say is a subject of great debate, right? What is the relationship between the historical events of the Holocaust in World War II and the creation of the state of Israel? The fact that the war ends in 1945 and the state comes into existence just 3 years later. As a historian, I look at that and I ask the question, is there some sort of a causal relationship here? What is the nature of that relationship? What are the factors connected to the end of the war and the creation of the state? What can we try to understand? But in addition to looking at that and trying to explain from a historical standpoint, what's the relationship between these two events, I'm also interested in looking at sort of a longitudinal study of the relationship between, or the state's relationship to the memory of the Holocaust. And in fact, most of what I'm going to speak about this evening looks more in that regard, asking the question of how has Israel as a state and how have Jews living in Israel, Israelis, remembered the Holocaust? And implicit in that question is I'm asking both about personal memory, that is, how have people as individuals remembered the events of the Holocaust, both those who were survivors and those who were immigrants who moved to Israel before the war, and those who were Sabras who were born and raised in Israel. What is the nature of individuals' relationship to the memory of the Holocaust? What is the nature of Israeli collective memory of the Holocaust? And how has that changed over time? Now, there's a lot at stake in this question, and it's a very current issue. So just this week, you can see here, this is a news story from earlier this week. Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of Israel, speaking in conjunction with the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. That was the conference in January of 1942, where the final solution essentially was plotted and the 80th anniversary was marked. And in his remarks, Bennett wanted to make sure that people understood that while the state of Israel exists, that we should all know that the state of Israel isn't ours, you can see at the bottom there, thanks to the Holocaust, but because the land of Israel is still and will always remain the home of the Jewish people. And so you can see that politicians, political leaders are very sensitive to this historical question, right? This is essentially a political question. It's also a historical question, right? Does the Jewish state exist because of what happened in the Second World War? Does the Jewish state exist because of the thousands of years connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, Jerusalem beating at the heart of the Jewish religion, and the efforts of many generations to maintain Jewish connection to the land, right? We can see even in this statement some of the sort of the contested nature of some of these historical questions. Now, if we think about this in terms of in a religious sense, some of you might be familiar with, I think this is the prayer that we recite at Bethel as part of the prayer for the state of Israel. And it doesn't necessarily directly reference any relationship between the Holocaust and the state of Israel, but we can see this notion of the idea that Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, is Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the first flowering of our redemption. Now that could mean any number of things, redemption, but to some, it's possible that they may infer some sort of an idea of a redemption of the Jewish people after the destruction of the Holocaust. The notion that in some sort of miraculous sense, or in some sort of a perhaps theological or divine sense of redemption, the Jewish people went from complete destruction, the almost complete annihilation of Jewish civilization in the Second World War, to rebirth in the state of Israel. And perhaps we can discuss whether we understand that in a religious sense or not. I should point out, by the way, I don't think this was mentioned at the beginning, that if people have questions as I go, please feel free to type them into the chat. And once I'm done speaking, I will go through and happily respond to questions that people have, but I'll save those questions that you type into the chat for the end. Now, even with when the state of Israel was created in May of 1948, after the British withdrawal and after the United Nations partition plan of November of 1947, you could see in the declaration of independence for the state of Israel some sensitivity to this issue. And so the text of the Declaration of Independence for the state of Israel, again, reinforces the sort of classical notion of Israel being the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, the lengthy generations-long connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the idea that that connection never ended despite living in dispersion for thousands of years, the history of various aliyot that made their way from the diaspora to the land of Israel, the efforts of the mapilim, of the pioneers, to come to the land of Israel. And yet there is a paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, which also states that the Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of the reestablishment in Eretz Yisrael of the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the community of nations. The survivors of the European catastrophe, as well as Jews, continued to migrate to Eretz Yisrael, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. Again, not that the Holocaust was the reason for the creation of the state, but it was yet another example and a clear demonstration of a long history of anti-Semitism that demonstrated the need to create a Jewish state. In Herzl's sort of classical formulation, the idea was that anti-Semitism would cease once and forever once the state of Israel would be created, because the nations of the world, the anti-Semites of the world, would realize that Jews were not such a threat. Now, as we know, this didn't happen, but that's a topic for a different discussion. Among survivors of the Holocaust themselves in the aftermath of the war, there was an intense and ardent desire to see the creation of the Jewish national home, to see the creation of the Jewish state. This illustration that I'm showing you here was one that comes from the Third Congress of the Surviving Jews, the Third Congress of the Sherit HaPleita, the surviving remnant of Jews in Europe. And among Jews in the displaced persons camps in Europe, there was an ardent Zionist enthusiasm. In surveys that were taken, some 95% of the survivors articulated desire to migrate to the land of Israel, that their conclusion to the destruction of European Jewry was clear, that the nation, the state of Israel, needed to be created. This image that you're looking at here is an interesting one because you can see it's from April of 1948. It's created after the UN partition plan, but before the war in May of 1948. And so you can see here at the bottom, the broken tree, which symbolizes the destruction of European Jewry, the tree that is cut in half. But we see one branch growing out, one branch sort of sprouting in a hopeful sense to indicate that Jewish life will continue even in the aftermath of the destruction. And out of the middle of that image, we see here a map of partitioned Palestine, if you can see in the middle, according to the idea of the United Nations Partition Plan of November of 1947. So the white areas being the land allocated for the Jewish state, and the dark areas being the land allocated for the Arab state. As one historian of the Jewish displaced persons, Zev Mankiewicz writes, for the survivors, from the outset, the dream of a Jewish home in Palestine permeated the public life of the Sherita Pleta, the surviving remnant. And even that term, Sherita Pleta, which comes from the writing of the prophets, the idea that even after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the prophets said there would be a remnant of the Jewish people that would survive and would rebuild the Jewish national home in that sense, in a biblical sense. But we can see it even here, the term that is used to refer to the survivors, the Sherita Pleta, the surviving remnant. In the wake of the Holocaust, Mankiewicz wrote, survivors understood that the creation of a Jewish state in the land of Israel was taken to be the last will and testament bequeathed by the dead to the living. For many, their almost intuitive Zionism stood for the warmth, unquestioning acceptance, and security of home. For the more politically minded, it signified the only real hope for the rescue and rehabilitation of the little that remained of European Jewry, and in the longer term, the promise of the Jewish future. So there was sort of, as he says, an intuitive sense on an emotional level that there had to be a Jewish national home created for the Jewish people after the destruction of the European Jewish civilization. But in a practical sense as well, Jewish displaced persons had nowhere to go. Jewish displaced persons who had become stateless refugees after the Second World War needed a homeland because they needed a state that they could go to that would take them in, right? And so we can see this both on an emotional level, the need for the Jewish state, and on practical level, the need to create a Jewish national home that would take in the stateless refugees. Of course, I think one of the reasons that we can see Israel's political leaders being sensitive to this equation is that there is a flip side to this equation between the Holocaust being a reason for the creation of the state of Israel. And this lies at the heart of a lot of Holocaust denial that we see in particular. So for example, this is a quotation that comes from actually the president of the Palestinian Authority's dissertation, Mahmoud Abbas, who in his dissertation, and he has withdrawn this statement subsequently, but he wrote about this and argued that the Zionist movement historically had inflated the number of Jews who had died in the Holocaust to gain the solidarity of international public opinion, and argues that, you know, in line with Holocaust deniers, that in fact, if you did some investigating into it, you would see that not as many Jews, and certainly not 6 million, had died during the Holocaust, right? And we see this in other circles. So for example, in Iran, you know, uses Holocaust denial as one of its weapons against the state of Israel. And several times now they have organized Holocaust cartoon contests to give awards to those who can create the best Holocaust denial cartoons, or those who would argue that Israel has invented, or the Jewish people have invented, the Holocaust as some justification for the creation of the state. And here you can see some of the examples from their cartoon contests in 2006 and again in 2016 that try to make the case that Israel uses the memory of the Holocaust to oppress the Palestinians, or for political purposes, or any number of cases that are made in these Holocaust denial cartoons. But we also know that in Israel, politically, the memory of the Holocaust seeps in or is invoked relatively frequently in political discourse. And so certainly Netanyahu, when he was prime minister and wanted to make the case that you know, Israel needed to defend itself staunchly against the threat of an Iranian nuclear attack, which would lead to the destruction of the state of Israel, of course, invoked the lessons of the Holocaust, much as Menachem Begin would also invoke the lessons of the Holocaust to say that Israel and Israel's leaders needed to internalize the lessons of the Holocaust in their political decision making, that they would not be able to bury their heads in the sand, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, the people of Israel lives and the eternity of Israel shall not die, and that you have to learn the lessons of the past, that there will not be another annihilation. So we can see the sort of the parameters of this debate or this dilemma or this ambivalence. On the one hand, from a classical Zionist perspective, as articulated in this short story by Chaim Chazaz about a character by the name of Yutka, who basically makes an argument in this story called The Sermon, that I don't want to, now that I live in the land of Israel, I don't want to know anything about the Jewish past, about Jewish history. I want to disconnect myself. The Jewish people have come to Israel to start themselves anew. Why should we be connected to the suffering of Jews living in dispersion, right? It's just a history of oppression, defamation, persecution, and martyrdom. Let's not even learn about it. Let's disconnect ourselves. To the other end of the spectrum, which is saying, no, we have to learn these lessons. We have to understand them. We have to know this history so that we can learn the lessons and inform our political decision-making around it, right? In a classical Zionist sense, this notion that Israel is a revolution against Jewish history, Israel represents the ways in which the Jewish people have negated their diaspora history and disconnected themselves from their diaspora history. Israel is an example of active Jews who control their own destiny, unlike passive diaspora Jews. We can see in that sort of classical Zionist relationship to Jewish history an ambivalent relationship to the Shoah, a question about what should we learn about it? What are the lessons that should be drawn from it? What aspects of the history of the Holocaust should the state of Israel focus on? Should Jewish people in the state of Israel learn about? And what we end up seeing for many, many years in Israel's history is that if the Holocaust was taught, it tended to focus only on Zionist heroes who participated in ghetto revolts and the partisans, etc., who actively resisted, that those were the models of what would be taught, not most other aspects of the Jewish history and Jewish responses to persecution during the war. Now, this has changed to a great extent in, I would say, the last 20 or 30 years. And one of the interesting things for us to try to understand is why? Why has that changed? What has changed? Why do we now see a much greater openness to learning about every aspect of Jewish history and the ways in which Jews responded to persecution during the war? Now, for a long time, right, the focal point was on the ghetto fighters, on those who organized the resistance, on those who rose up against the Nazis. And we can understand that why this would be the focal point, why this would be sort of the connection that would be made in terms of the choices that we made, right? If we have to remember, this is what we want to remember. We can even see this being invoked up to the present day. So, for example, at the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 2018, Ron Lauder, the president of the World Jewish Congress, made the argument, right, that it was the resistance of the ghetto fighters in Warsaw that gave the Jewish fighters in the land of Israel the strength to rise up and fight against everyone else, that they had learned this lesson and imbibed this lesson that had come from the Warsaw Ghetto to learn how to fight. This also goes back to a notion that we see in a lot of sort of Zionist thinking about the relationship to the history of the Holocaust and the relationship to Jewish behavior during the war. This notion that we should only celebrate the heroes, we should only celebrate those who fought back, and not focus on those who went like sheep to the slaughter. And we can see this dichotomy represented in all kinds of ways. So, for example, at the monument to the ghetto heroes in Warsaw, you can see on the one hand, the sort of Jewish fighters who emerge from the stone and emerge into the historical space. And on the back of the monument, those Jews who are marched to the Umschlagplatz, to their deportation, to their death in Treblinka, sort of receding into the stone. Active Jews versus passive Jews. But I want to talk about some aspects of this that I think have been largely unexamined until now. And while I mentioned that, one of the important things for us to understand is to look at it historically to understand what the connection of World War II was on the effort to create the Jewish state, it's an important question because in many ways, while it might be assumed that the Holocaust aided in the creation of the state. In many ways, the Holocaust, World War II itself, actually presented great obstacles to the creation of the Jewish state. The British had imposed their blockade on Palestine, which was going to limit migration to 15,000 for the next 5 years, or 75,000 between 1939 and 1945. The timing could not be worse. For the Jewish state and the Yishuv in Palestine, the demographic reality was that they needed to get immigrants from Europe to build up the state. The destruction of European Jewry meant there would be no immigrants to build up the state. And in many ways, we can see that the destruction of European Jewry actually presented even greater obstacles. The truth is that in 1945, the world was not coming forward saying we have to give the Jewish people a state because of what happened during the war. The truth is that in the aftermath of the war, the question of what to do with the survivors of the Holocaust, and more specifically, what to do with stateless Jewish refugees after the war, this was in many ways sort of the driving factor that led the international community, in particular the United Nations, to advocate for Palestine as a solution to the problem of the displaced persons. This idea that when they went to the DP camps, the international community said, we have stateless refugees, no country wants to take them in. The United States was not changing its immigration policy. International observers essentially said, let's send them to a Jewish state in Palestine. At least this will solve the problem of the stateless Jewish refugees. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to get into some aspects of this history that I think haven't been focused upon, because the classical explanation is that Israel really did not focus on the history of the Holocaust until the Eichmann trial. That is, until the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, there wasn't much of a relationship between teaching Israelis about the history of the Holocaust. And the truth is that when you start to look at it from the perspective of even the immediate aftermath of the war, you see lots of discussion about what happened in Europe and Jewish experiences during the war. So, for example, this is one of the ghetto fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto, Tzivia Lebetkin, standing in Kibbutz Yagur in June of 1946. So this is 1 year after the war. And her arrival in Palestine in 1946 was a huge event. A lot of newspaper focus on one of the surviving ghetto fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto has come to the Yishuv, has come to the land of Israel. Let's hear her story. Here you can see a picture of her standing. You can see her in the middle, offering her testimony. For 8 hours straight, she stood and told her story of her experiences during the war in the Warsaw Ghetto, and also organizing the resistance and then fighting in the revolt. And there was immense newspaper coverage on this. And this was already in June of 1946, her telling her story about the Jews and how they suffered and died, and also how they fought back. Although again, we see this invocation of the motif of going like sheep to the slaughter. Lebetkin, Tzivia, and her husband, Antek Yitzchak Zuckerman, were the driving force behind the creation of what was actually Israel's first Holocaust museum, which you can see pictured here. This was the Ghetto Fighters House, or Kibbutz Lochamei Getaot, which is located in the north near Akko. And it's Israel's first Holocaust museum. It was established in 1949, tells the story of the underground, tells the story of the resistance, is a very, very impressive educational institution in Israel. And if you haven't been there, I would definitely encourage people to go visit there. It's a little different from Yad Vashem also in its orientation to the way in which it teaches the history of the Holocaust. Lebetkin, in fact, on the 8th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 1951, also dedicated another monument in the newly created state of Israel, which was called the Martyrs Forest, which you can see a picture here, Ya'ar Kdoshim, the Martyrs Forest. And as she said at the dedication of the Martyrs Forest, she said, "Bless the Jewish National Fund for establishing 2 monuments to the living and the silent, the ghetto fighters kibbutz in the north, here near Jerusalem, the martyrs' forest, the forest which will take root and remind all who pass the horrors of the Holocaust and the destruction and the secret of bravery. Now, this forest actually, a lot of it was burned recently in a forest fire, but hopefully it will grow back. Another early monument which was created, as you can see here at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai. This is the monument to Mordechai Anilevich at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, also created by Natan Rappaport, who also created the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto fighters in Warsaw. And you can see this monument to Mordechai Anilevich here. He actually models it after Michelangelo's David. And it's actually a rather remarkable monument because it is a monument both to, you can see in the background, the destroyed water tower. This was a kibbutz that withstood an Egyptian invasion in the war in 1948, held off the Egyptian invaders for a time, helping to allow reinforcements to come in. And so the fact that you see this monument to Mordechai Anilevich, the fact that the kibbutz is renamed after Mordechai Anilevich, creates this linkage between the fighters of the Haganah who defended this kibbutz from the Egyptian invasion and Mordechai Anilevich who defended the Warsaw Ghetto from the Nazi liquidation in April of 1943. So these are examples that actually precede the creation of Yad Vashem, which is the sort of more commonly understood Israeli National Holocaust Museum. And we'll talk about the importance of Yad Vashem as well. Yad Vashem, as we can see here, was created after, actually its origins date to the period of the war itself, but it's officially enshrined in law with the passage of the Yom HaShoah VeHaGvura law in 1959, which marks Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day as Yom HaShoah, the 27th of Nisan, a date that usually falls roughly in the month of April, was selected to coincide with the timing of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which actually broke out on the first night of Passover, which would have been the 14th of Nisan. You couldn't make Yom HaShoah to coincide with Passover, so a date was selected 2 weeks later when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising still would have been ongoing, and also 1 week before Israel's Independence Day. So you can see even on the Jewish calendar, this duality that was created between Yom HaShoah VeHaGvura, Israel's day to remember the Shoah, the destruction of European Jewry, and the heroism of the ghetto fighters, and then 1 week later, Israel's Independence Day, well, actually Yom HaZikaron, and then Yom HaAtzmaut. And for those who have been in Israel, again, I think it's interesting for us to consider, we're talking about January 27th as Holocaust Remembrance Day, to consider that as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as opposed to a date on the Jewish calendar, which is the Jewish people's National Day of Holocaust Remembrance. And maybe we can discuss the difference between those two. I'm not going to play that for now. But like I said before, the standard explanation of Israel's relationship to the Holocaust is that Israelis basically, didn't talk about the Holocaust or discouraged discussion of the Holocaust, or survivors were discouraged from talking about the Holocaust until the Eichmann trial. And it was only at the time of the Eichmann trial, which also took place, sorry, I'm going to skip ahead here. It was only at the time of the Eichmann trial that sort of conversation and discussion about the Shoah became more prominent in Israeli life. And that first that began with the Eichmann trial, and then after the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, which showed Israel that it could also be vulnerable, and then after the election of Menachem Begin in 1977, do we see much greater conversation and discussion about the Holocaust in Israeli society. Begin, as a political leader, was much more likely to invoke the memory of the Holocaust. Also, as someone who has fled as a refugee from Poland, there was also sort of a deeply personal connection to this history, which he was unafraid to invoke in a way that Ben-Gurion and earlier leaders might have been more ambivalent about it, undermining sort of their notion of the Zionist history and the connection to the land of Israel. And what I'm going to argue in this book, and what a lot of my research in the book shows, is that Israel actually has a much closer relationship to the memory of the Shoah than has traditionally been taught. And many Israelis have sought to work through the traumatic memory of the war since World War II. And we're going to see a couple of examples, which I'll show you now, that see that on the individual level, on the collective level, on the sort of societal level, you see all sorts of work being done in the early years of the state to engage with the memory of the Holocaust, to process the memory of the Holocaust in a way that took place long before the state itself sort of embraced this broader narrative of how people should remember the Holocaust. Political leaders for many years tried to maintain some emotional distance from the memory of the Shoah, perhaps invoking and using the memory of the Holocaust when it was politically expedient, but distancing themselves on a personal level. And what we can see more so in recent years is a much deeper personal connection to the memory of the Holocaust. I'll just take you through a couple of examples, and then I'll wrap up so that we can have some time for some questions. And this is based on some more recent research that I've done and some things that I've found that I think are very interesting, sort of off the beaten path, let's say, sites of Holocaust memory in Israel that often do not get much focus or attention, but suggest that there were many ways in which Jews in Israel were connecting to this history in different ways than the state perhaps wanted them to. So I don't know how many people have been here or have seen this. This is a site that is called Martef HaShoah, the Chamber of the Holocaust. It is located in Jerusalem. It is just outside the walls of the old city. And so actually, it's located under a yeshiva, just outside the walls of the old city. And if you think about sort of the map of Jerusalem as it existed from 1949 to 1967, when the old city itself was in the hands of Jordan, this was a site that was about as close as Jewish people could get to the Western Wall in Jerusalem without actually accessing the Kotel, right? So think of this as kind of like holy ground, right? This is about as close as you could situate a Holocaust memorial to the holiest ground of the Jewish people. And it's a remarkable space that has existed since 1949, is very much off the beaten path, but was also created as a site by Holocaust survivors who literally brought ashes of Jews who had died in Poland and said, we need a place to bury these ashes. And so you can still see urns that were brought by Jews who came and collected these ashes from concentration camps and extermination camps in Poland and brought them for burial to Israel. And the idea was that this Holocaust memorial cellar would be created as a memorial site. It is very much invokes sort of a religious sense of memory, and even has on display what they claim to be soap manufactured in Nazi laboratories using human body oil. This is not, it's been debunked. It's not soap made from human fat. Yad Vashem has been asking them for years to remove this plaque, and yet it's still there, and they're probably not going to remove it because they say this is what people at the time thought it was. So because people at the time thought that this was soap made from human fat, they want to display it. But also they have really interesting artifacts, like a Jew who was forced to sort of take a Torah scroll and desecrate it, but turned it into clothing that he would wear that would save his life to keep him warm, calling it a coat of revenge made from a Torah scroll. You can also see here in Martef HaShoah, in the Holocaust Memorial Cellar, plaques to every destroyed community. There are over 2,000 of these plaques on display, where Jews who had survived from individual communities created memorial plaques that they would put up on display. And on the Memorial Day for those destroyed communities, perhaps when the community was, you needed to know when to observe the yort site for this destroyed community, you would go and visit this site. Likewise, in a cemetery in Holon, just on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, you also see what I think is a really remarkable display that also dates to the early period after the creation of the states, the 1950s. survivors from individual towns creating memorial sites that they would go visit, essentially to recall their destroyed communities. This is in the cemetery, and you have these amazing synagogues, right? So this is, for example, from Piotrków Trybunalski in Poland, and the great synagogue from Piotrków, which was destroyed, right? This is a memorial to that site, and also a memorial to the destroyed Jewish community of Piotrków. Or, for example, a memorial site to Sobibor and the Jewish community of Włodawa, on the where the Sobibor extermination camp was located, on the outskirts of it. So again, these are, I think, rather remarkable sort of grassroots memorial sites that existed in Israel already from the late 40s into the 1950s. These were not state-sanctioned memorial sites. These were sites that Jews who had come to Israel and survivors or refugees from towns created to recall their sites. And one of the interesting things that we can see already in the 1950s is this playing out of a tension between how should Israel relate to the memory of the Holocaust, how should Israel relate to Germany and the nation of Germany. This plays out in the protests over the reparations agreements, which were the largest protests that Israel had seen, almost led to the overthrow of Ben-Gurion's labor government, led by Menachem Begin, protesting the idea that Israel would accept reparations from Germany, which eventually lead to the formation of the Claims Conference, right? This idea that Begin was protesting against, that we have to erase the shame, right? Damenu, we cannot atone our blood. This was essentially referred to as blood money, right? We shouldn't take money to repay for Jewish lives, right? And this was, in some sense, kind of the very emotional, visceral response to the idea that Israel would have any sort of practical relationship with Germany, but also treat the memory of the Holocaust in a practical, political, or economic sense, right? The counter argument was, of course, that this was not money that was being accepted as blood money. This was money that was being taken for destroyed Jewish businesses and homes and property that was owed to the Jewish people. But we could even see there this tension between, let's call it sort of the emotional connection to the history of the war, and the very practical, rational thought process about how the Jewish state should relate to the memory of the Holocaust. Of course, Israel does sign the reparations agreement in 1952, and as does the Conference on Jewish Material Claims. And I won't go into this now, but I'd be happy to discuss it. There's a lot of reasons why it made sense for Israel to reach out to Germany and come to this conclusion, which I'd be happy to discuss further. In the 1950s, long before Eichmann, there were a number of famous court cases that took place that dealt with the memory of the Holocaust. Jews who would be identified in the streets, for example, as kapos, were tried. There were honor courts which would try Jews on the charge of collaboration with the Nazis. The most famous case was the Kastner affair. Rudolf Kastner, who was a Hungarian Zionist leader who negotiated with the SS to try to save Jews. This famous train of Kastner that was able to save close to 1,500 Jews, but then after the war, he was accused of essentially having collaborated to save his own people rather than warn Hungarian Jewry of imminent destruction. He eventually was assassinated in Israel in 1957. So again, this was a huge deal. This was before Eichmann. This shows us again the degree to which this was a topic of intense public debate and discussion over the course of the 1950s. Now, of course, the trial of Adolf Eichmann was very much seen as an opportunity by David Ben-Gurion as Prime Minister of Israel after the capture of Eichmann to teach the Israeli public about the lessons of the Holocaust. As he said, we have to understand that we have to teach the details of the horrors to the generation of Israelis who have grown up since the Holocaust. I don't care whether they want to know them, they ought to know them. They should be taught the lesson that Jews are not sheep to be slaughtered, but a people could hit back as Jews did in the War of Independence. You can see again a very clear idea of what are the lessons that we should teach Israelis out of the Eichmann trial. And I talked about Tzivi Lebetkin before. She was one of the over 100 witnesses who testified at the Eichmann trial and told her story. Other witnesses told their story. And this was, for many Israelis, the first time that they had heard Holocaust survivors share their stories, share their experiences. And I think this is important. It's not that survivors were quiet and didn't talk about it. They talk amongst themselves. We can see a lot of memorialization. We can see all of these sites of people wanting to commemorate, but there was a disconnect, a divide between survivors and the broader Israeli public. In the interest of time, I'll skip the video excerpt. You can go to the Yad Vashem site and see very interesting testimony. You know what, I'll play 2 minutes of Tzivia speaking at the Eichmann trial, because you can also see how powerful this would have been for Israelis to hear.
שכשהתקרבו הגרמנים תחת העמדות שלנו,
She's talking about the Warsaw Ghetto
זרעו
Uprising.
בסך, ואנחנו זרקנו את הפצצות והרימונים, וראינו דם גרמני ניגר ברחובותיה של ורשה. אחרי זה שהרבה דם ודמעות יהודי ניגרו ברחובותיה של ורשה קודם לכן. שמחה גדולה, ולא היה חשוב מה יהיה מחר. שמחה גדולה הייתה בין הלוחמים היהודים. וראה זה פלא, הגיבורים הגדולים הגרמנים נסוגו בפחד עצום בפני הרימונים היהודיים והפצצות היהודיות מתוצרת בית. וראינו כעבור שעה איך שהקצין מדרבן את החיילים לצאת לקרב, לאסוף את הפצועים, ואף אחד מהם לא זז, ועזבו את פצועיהם, שאחר כך אנחנו אספנו מהם את נשקם.
Okay, so you can see even in this testimony, which is delivered in Hebrew and spoke directly to an Israeli public, also talking about the heroism of the ghetto fighters, but also the significance of the idea that Jews had fought back and taken revenge and lived to see the day that they saw German blood flowing in the streets. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I think one of the things that's important is that for many, many years, so this is, for example, a memorial another Rappaport memorial that was created in the Ya'ar Kedoshim, in the Martyrs Forest, which situates, again, the Holocaust within a broad understanding of Jewish history. Actually, that's my mother. You can see there standing next to it. Gives you a little sense of perspective in terms of the size of the monument. But again, puts the Holocaust within the broader scope of Jewish history, but also understands this notion of there are two tablets, and we go from destruction, Mishoah, Litkuma, from destruction to rebirth. And that is how we understand the history of the Holocaust in terms of its relationship to the eventual creation of the state. I'll just end by noting that what's quite remarkable is the ways in which, since the 1980s, Israel's relationship to the Holocaust has changed, and in many ways become much more personal. And it in interesting ways, it actually parallels a process that we've seen here in the United States, which is there's a much greater openness to learning about the history of the Holocaust. There's a much greater openness to understanding and hearing the stories of survivors and hearing the stories of the children of survivors. So we can see this in film, for example, in the beginning of the 1980s, we see more and more, and certainly today, we can think about countless documentaries and films that we see that tell many, many remarkable, both dramatic and documentary form films about the history of the Holocaust. But also in popular culture, Israelis who were children of survivors, who were essentially sabras, who grew up in Israel, beginning again in the 1980s in particular, to process their relationship to their parents' experiences and think about it and produce it for a broader Israeli public. So you can see here, for example, this is Yehuda Poliker, who by the time he creates this album, Efer Va'avak, which is ashes and dust, he is a Israeli rock star. And so it's quite remarkable when he creates this album, and I'll just play a couple of clips here so you can get a sense, both of him talking about the process of creating the album, and then musically wanting to go back to Salonika and share his father's experiences of being one of the last surviving Jews from Salonika who survived Auschwitz, to talk about it and share that with the broader Israeli public.
אפשר להגיד שגדלתי בעצם במחנה ריכוז עם דירות תיל דמיוניים, ופה ושם הייתה לי ילדות יפה, אבל כל פעם שהייתי מגיע הביתה זה היה מחנה ריכוז.
Sorry, it doesn't have subtitles. He's saying that, he had sort of a normal childhood, but every time he came home, he was back behind the barbed wire, right? The concentration camp. And that was his experience, right? Of living as an Israeli child, but then sort of having the Holocaust be around them at home all the time. And part of the work that he does here in this album is to process those memories. So I'm going to share a little bit of this so you can hear how he does this and the ways in which this then also opens up a space for Israelis to engage more directly with sort of diaspora Jewish culture.
יום אביב ריחות לילך בין חורבות העיר שלך, יום יפה לדור בנהר, בתוכי הלב נשבר. שם הייתה בינה ילדותך אישה קטנה, אנשים שאיש לא מכיר, אין אפילו בית שיזכיר. ואם את נוסעת, לאן את נוסעת? הנצח הוא רק אפר ועבר.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, but he's sort of talking about this childhood home that is destroyed, this community that's destroyed. Wherever you go, it's forever dust and ashes. Since the 1980s, of course, we've seen March of the Living become a central component. All Israeli youth participate in these pilgrimages to Auschwitz and to other camps in Poland. We see it become a more central part. We see prominent figures, for example, like the chief rabbi of Israel, or the former chief rabbi of Israel, Holocaust survivors. Now we see prominent figures, children of survivors, like Benny Gantz, for example, child of survivors, prominent political figures. And we even see the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, make the statement that on Yom HaShoah, all of us, each and every one of us, has a number tattooed on his arm. So we can see the ways in which we've traced this journey from sort of an emotional distance from the memory of the Shoah, a practical political distance from the memory of the Shoah, to one in which today it is a very central component of Israel's national identity. And what I think is interesting is to try to consider the reasons why that has happened and the ways in which this sort of embrace of a memory of the Shoah, an embrace of an individual memory of the Shoah, one that is connected to each individual's experience, to a survivor's experience, to the roots that people have in their hometowns that they come from. Here you can see the Valley of the Communities in Yad Vashem, is actually the realization of a process that was always there, right? A process of an emotional connection that survivors had, that refugees had, that people who came from specific homelands, hometowns had, and that today we see a much closer connection on the part of the political establishment and the state of Israel and the Holocaust to the relationship that Israelis have had to the Holocaust. All right, I am gonna wrap up. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop my screen share now, and I'm very happy to go through and take any questions that have come in. So I see a couple of questions, and I'll just say there are a couple of questions that have come into the chat. So David, if we have time, I'm happy to take a few questions that have come in.
Sure.
Yeah, so some people have typed questions directly to me. Yeah, so this is a question about sort of K-12 curricula in Israel taught about the Holocaust. And I think it's a really good question. This is a question that came in from Alan. Hi, Alan. Look forward to seeing you back on the softball field. It's a really good question, and actually it's especially an interesting question for us to consider when we consider our efforts to incorporate Holocaust education into our curricula, for example, here in the state of Connecticut or in other countries. It's very interesting to do in a comparative framework. So it's very much embedded in all sorts of different ways, depending on the type of school that one is in or the type of school system. There are obviously very robust curricula. What I think is interesting, so Alan in his question asked about K-12. There's been some controversy about this question. So just to answer your question, Alan, it's taught at every level. The history of the Holocaust is taught in many different ways. It has gone over from what was the traditional standard teaching for many years, which just focused on, to a disproportionate extent, on resistance, on Jews who fought with the ghetto fighters, on Jews who were the partisans, to become a more sort of broad-based approach to many different aspects of survival, many different aspects of the Jewish experience. So it's much more sort of robust in terms of teaching about all sorts of different aspects of Jewish experience. And it culminates in sort of the teen trip to Poland and the experience. And that, what's interesting about that is that also makes the memory of the Shoah sort of a universal Israeli experience, right? So it becomes part of the national collective memory, even if you come from you're descended from Jews from Yemen or from Iraq or from Iran, that this becomes part of sort of the collective national experience. What's interesting is that we're starting to see even more focus, for example, on the experiences of Jews from North Africa in the Holocaust, also incorporated into curricula. And I think that's a response also to different Jews in Israel wanting to see their own experiences incorporated into the broader curriculum. What I mentioned has been sort of controversial is the question of like, what is too young, and the question of what do you teach younger children, and that has been the subject of a great deal of debate. So there's a question that I think I'm going to read. I don't think people can see the questions, so I have to read them. So Rabbi Rosen asks, what are your thoughts regarding the work of Hannah Arendt on the Eichmann trial? How responsible was she for the increased emphasis on the Holocaust in Israeli society? So that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that she, and I think I may have, I don't know if in my quote I quoted from her, but she was critical of a number of things, and also said some very controversial things about the Eichmann trial. Critical of the ways in which she saw sort of David Ben-Gurion using it for political purposes and wanting to teach a very clear political message about sort of Jewish behavior during the war, and privileging or focusing only on the experiences of ghetto fighters and other heroes, and sort of wanting to teach that message, which he said very clearly, this is what I want to teach, the idea that Jews can fight back. But what I think, Arendt was also criticized for was her thesis about the banality of evil, and sort of her takeaway in terms of trying to understand where someone like Eichmann could come from. I don't know if she's, we can see her being responsible for increased emphasis, but more so I think being kind of an observer on what was taking place and noting the significance of this historical event. I mean, it is 100% sort of a turning point in Israel's relationship to the Holocaust. But I think one of the interesting things, and sort of we could call her an unsung hero. So when Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General, is sort of building his case against Eichmann, he relies on a few people to help him build the case. He definitely worked closely with Antek Zuckerman and Tivi Lebetkin, who were sort of the acknowledged resistance heroes, ghetto fighters. But he also worked with a woman by the name of Rochel Auerbach, who was also a survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto, and who had worked closely together. Those of you who know Sam Cassow's work on the Ringelblum archive, Auerbach had worked closely together with Ringelblum, and she was one of the few survivors who was able to locate the archive. And she ends up coming to Yad Vashem to work in Israel after the war, and she organized the oral history department at Yad Vashem and began the process of collecting testimonies from survivors. And Auerbach was instrumental in what ended up being the over 100 survivors who were given the opportunity to share their story as part of the trial, to not only educate the Israeli public and the world, right? One of the first times, and you can go to the Spielberg Video Archive, for example. If you go online through Hebrew University, you can watch every testimony. It's on YouTube from the Eichmann trial. But the fact that we were able to hear survivors offer their testimony in a large part was both a decision of Hausner and of Rochel Auerbach. So it's a remarkable outcome of that trial as well. Let's see. So Robin asks, and Robin, if you don't mind, I'll just read it out loud. The state of Israel was able to be created because institutions needed for successful state had been created well in advance of the Holocaust. The world's shame and reluctance to take in Jews led them to vote for partition. In that way, the Holocaust helped propel the official acceptance. Would you agree with this assessment? So I think that's a good way to put it, Robin. That is that all the instruments, the elements needed for the creation of the state were in place, right? The Zionist movement had worked, from the first Aliyah and then from the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and then after the Balfour Declaration, to build all the instruments needed for the creation of the state. The Jewish Agency was basically the political entity that was the state within the making. Ben-Gurion had all those elements there. What they didn't have in 1939 and 1945 was enough people, right? There were about 600,000 Jews living in Palestine and double that number of Arabs living in Palestine. And so from a demographic standpoint, if a state had been created, it wouldn't have been a Jewish state. And that's where your second point, I think, is an important one, which is that we have to try to understand why the United Nations would vote for partition. And part of it, you phrase it, Robin, as sort of the world's shame, but also, I think that the one of the points of bitterness for survivors was the silence of the world during the war and in the aftermath of the war. And on a practical level, and this is, I think we have to understand this, before the war, no one wanted to take Jews in, right? We had a refugee crisis growing in the 1930s, and there's a conference in Evian to say, who wants to take in Jews? Nobody wants to take in Jews in 1938. This leads Hitler and the Nazis to say, we can do whatever we want with the Jews. Nobody cares about them. Holocaust, World War II, nobody takes in Jews. Aftermath of the war, you have hundreds of thousands of Jewish displaced persons, refugees. United States doesn't change its immigration policy really until 1950. Very few countries want to take in Jews. So on a practical level, this explains why the United Nations votes for partition and says, well, we have to put these refugees somewhere, right? So maybe it's not the Holocaust, but maybe it's the consequences of the Holocaust. It's the fate of the refugees that becomes a determinative factor in the creation of the state. All right, I don't know if there are more questions, but if not, David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, thanks again so much for giving this important and informative presentation, Avi. It was just tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, the Men's Club would like to present you with this clock that I will deliver in person to you.
Okay, great.
Thanks again.
I was looking behind me to see if I have one of those clocks. Oh, wait. You guys are going to laugh at me.
Uh-oh.
Thank you, Men's Club. Yeah.
And thanks again to everybody who came to this presentation and for attending the Men's Club event. And please come to other events that we are putting on. We're trying to get as many people involved as we can. And if you have ideas of things you'd like to see, please reach out to any member of the board and any member of the Men's Club, and we'd definitely like to hear your ideas as well. So thanks everyone. Thank you again, Avi, and everybody have a great night.
All right, good night. Thank you for organizing. Nice to see everyone. Everybody stay healthy. Hope to see you in person soon.
Thanks very much.